June 9th. Jackson ordered Ewell to move his men in the very early morning hours toward Port Republic as rapidly as possible. His plan was to leave Trimble's brigade plus a few other units of Ewell's division in place to hold Fremont at bay if he advanced while Jackson attacked Tyler and Carroll at Lewiston. Tolliver was to cross the South River with his brigade at dawn. In the meantime, Shields himself, along with Kimball's brigade, was actually on the march that night. He had reached Columbia Bridge by the evening the night before and wanted to fight around Conrad's store. Carroll once again proposed to Tyler that they fall back there, but Tyler insisted on staying in Lewiston, confident that Shields would arrive. Neither Union commander realized that by 4 a.m., Jackson had most of his army across the North River, and by 5 a.m., he was starting to cross the South River over a quickly constructed footbridge. The Stonewall Brigade advanced first, minus the 33rd Virginia, which was still on the far side of the North River. Carpenter's battery scattered the Union pickets with a few shots. Winder sent the 2nd Virginia into woods south of the Luray Road to flank the Federal artillery further ahead on a hill called the Coaling. Unfortunately for the Confederates, Jackson immediately ordered his units to attack as soon as they had crossed the South River without amassing them first, and, thus, the battle began with piecemeal attacks. On the Coaling, the Union had concentrated 7 guns of Robinson and Clark's batteries on the Coaling itself, with 5 more guns of Huntington's battery on the intersection of Lewiston Lane and the Luray Road. Although the position was formidable, it had a serious weakness. Sloping ground in front of the Coaling made it vulnerable to flanking fire. A small ravine just southwest of the Coaling, where the tiny Deep Run Creek flowed, was obscured by underbrush and provided good concealment for a potential flanking force. Winder sent the 4th Virginia after the 2nd with a section of Carpenter's battery. At 6 a.m., the battle proper began when 2 guns of Pogue's battery opened fire on Union positions. Carroll immediately suggested that the entire force withdraw back to Conrad's store, but Tyler refused and began deploying his forces into line along the Lewiston Lane. Daum moved 5 guns from Clark and Huntington's batteries northwest closer to the river. Skirmishing began between the 7th Indiana and the 5th Virginia. 1 company each of the 5th and 66th Ohio were posted in woods in front of the Coaling as a forward screen, with the remainder of the 66th supporting the guns and the last 2 regiments, the 84th and 110th Pennsylvania, further behind the Coaling. That was Tyler and Carroll's entire force. No more reserves were available. Union artillery had trouble at first. Huntington's battery used Schenkel shells with papier-mâché sabot that had swelled in the humid environment. After shaving down the sabot to fit the shells in the cannon bore, firing began. 1 of Pogue's guns moved to the Confederate left. As this was happening, Winder sent the 5th and 27th Virginia forward in the open. Without reinforcements, they could do little but endure the Union fire in the open. Meanwhile, the 2nd Virginia arrived within 100 yards of the Coaling and began firing on the gunners. However, 1 gun fired grapeshot at them, and the 66th Ohio suddenly emerged and opened fire on the Virginians, driving them back. The 4th Virginia was similarly driven back. The necessary reinforcements were delayed by traffic jams in Port Republic and the narrowness of the rickety footbridge. Eventually, the Louisiana Brigade finally made it across and began moving to the battlefield. Jackson ordered them, minus the 7th Louisiana, which he attached to Winder, to attack the Coaling. Winder knew he had to attack, At 8:30 a.m., with the 7th Louisiana in position, he advanced on the right of the Union line with Pogue's guns following them. The Union line held their fire until the Confederates were close, then unleashed a volley that tore gaps in the ranks and set the rebels slowly back to a wooden fence they had crossed and began exchanging fire. They endured an hour of this barrage before finally falling back. The 7th Louisiana itself lost 156 men, nearly half their strength, along with their regimental colors. The Union line then advanced forward. The 31st Virginia, which Winder had held in reserve, advanced against the Federals to buy time for the others to reassemble. Unfortunately for them, they advanced too far forward and were severely battered, losing 97 men killed or wounded, almost 43% of their strength. The 52nd Virginia now entered the fight. They collided with the 7th Indiana and 29th Ohio and were similarly thrashed, losing over 100 men before withdrawing. Next up was the 25th Virginia, which was also halted. Just then, Ewell, who had been advancing with the 44th and 58th Virginia toward the Coaling, wheeled those regiments to the left when he saw Winder's force getting beaten. This surprise flanking attack stopped the Union assault on Winder and forced them to face the new threat. Both Virginian regiments suffered serious casualties before withdrawing back into woods. This brief respite for Winder had allowed him to rally his battered troops into a weak line of battle while Jackson funneled more regiments toward the Coaling. Jackson now ordered Trimble and Campbell's brigades to cross the North River to Port Republic and burn the bridge behind them. Milroy had been trying to get Fremont to be ready to attack since just after midnight, but he had refused to make ready before 10 a.m. By that time, the battlefield of Cross Keys had been abandoned by the Confederates. The Louisiana Brigade formed up next. They charged the Coaling, exchanging volleys with the 66th Ohio, capturing some of Clark's guns and forcing Huntington's battery to withdraw. What remained of Clark's guns blasted canister fire into the Louisianans. The 5th and 7th Ohio disengaged from Winder's front and moved toward Lewiston to attack the rebel flank. The 84th and 110th Pennsylvania also moved toward the Coaling. Battery horses were killed to prevent the withdrawal of the Union guns. When the Ohioans arrived, heavy close-quarters combat began. The Ohioans managed to temporarily beat back the Louisianans. Federals tried to extricate the guns by hand, but the Louisianans fired at the men who attempted to do so. Only one gun was able to be withdrawn before the Louisiana Brigade resumed its attack. This was done by a team of only 2 horses, a member of the 7th Ohio, and another Union soldier who had been previously shot through the mouth. Writing after the battle, H. Rhodes, that soldier of the 7th Ohio, described the experience. Quote, "I had hold of the right wheel and lifted till I could see stars. My comrade at the left wheel, each time he lifted, the blood would issue from his cheeks like soap bubbles." The 58th and 44th Virginia now joined in the fight for the Coaling. The 2nd and 4th Virginia also advanced to support, and Tolliver's brigade was approaching the battlefield. The Louisiana Brigade and the supporting Confederate units resumed the assault on the Coaling. It was now 10 a.m. Under this pressure, the Union position finally shattered. All but one of Huntington's guns was lost. That one gun fired double canister at the approaching Louisianans, which halted their charge long enough to pull out. The captured Union guns, however, were soon turned about and began firing at the fleeing troops. Some of the 7th Indiana escaped by swimming across the South Fork and made it to Fremont's army. Other Federal soldiers escaped into the hills, scrambling through underbrush to elude capture. A soldier of the 29th Ohio described the route. As we fell back, the rebels poured canister into our ranks, strewing the field and road with dead, dying, and wounded. I was wounded in my left hand and shoulder while falling back over the open ground, and my comrades were shot down like blackbirds, some of them being shot after having surrendered. The exhausted Confederates pursued them for about 4 or 5 miles, before turning around and leaving Munford's cavalry to continue. Munford had little luck in destroying his quarry, however. Union troops kept him in check, including the remnants of the 29th Ohio, who formed an infantry square at one point. Back at the Coaling, the carnage was severe. After the war, General Taylor said, "I have never seen so many dead and wounded in the same limited space." The Confederates finished crossing into Port Republic and burned the bridge behind them as ordered, leaving Fremont with nothing to do but witness the aftermath of the morning's battle from the north bank. Fremont began opening artillery fire on rebel wagons on the far side of the river, but the shots also fell among the wounded and ambulances. Jackson ordered his army to move through trails in the foothills until they reached Mount Vernon Furnace at the entrance to Brown's Gap, where they encamped on slopes and endured an evening rain shower. The battle had cost the rebels 92 killed, 690 wounded, and 36 missing, for a total of 818 casualties. The Union had lost 67 killed, 393 wounded, and 558 missing, mostly captured prisoners, for a total of 1,018 casualties. Given the disproportion in numbers of Jackson's army compared to Carroll and Tyler, this was a very hard victory for Jackson. Even his supporters critiqued him for sending in attacks piecemeal, rather than concentrating his troops first. Additionally, the battle didn't gain Jackson or the Confederacy much in exchange for the losses. Lincoln had already decided to pull McDowell and Shields out of the valley to reinforce McClellan and halt Fremont at Harrisonburg. What was left of Carroll and Tyler's brigade met the rest of Shields' division on the retreat to Conrad's store. Many enlisted men angrily blamed Carroll for not burning the bridge the day before, believing that he had disobeyed an order to do so from Shields. Officers in the division, however, focused their displeasure on the absent general. Shields would never fight another battle in the war again and would eventually resign from the army the next year. The next day, Fremont began his withdrawal back to Harrisonburg. When he arrived in the afternoon, he learned of Lincoln's order to halt there. It was also here that he met with Brigadier General Carl Schurz, who Lincoln had sent to observe and report on the status of Fremont's army. Seeing the dejected march back to Harrisonburg, and Fremont explained that Jackson must have been reinforced and that he would need to continue retreating down the valley, Schurz wrote Washington a long report on the matter. Among the enlisted ranks, Blenker's Germans resumed their looting of private property. This same day, Alexander Lawton's Georgia Brigade began arriving in Port Republic. These troops had been rerouted to the valley on their way to Richmond. On the 11th, Shields continued his lies and ridiculous bombast. Having been ordered to withdraw to Luray, he stated that he had to remain at Columbia Bridge because a third of his troops were without shoes, and at the same time claimed that he had prepared a joint attack on Jackson with Fremont for the day before, but the orders from Washington had forced him to cancel them. Munford's cavalry harassed Fremont as his army retreated to New Market that night. Fremont believed that Jackson had recrossed the river with a massively reinforced army and was on the attack. Back in Richmond, Lee ordered John Bell Hood and Evander Law's brigades to move to the valley under the overall command of Brigadier General William H.C. Whiting. Lee wanted Jackson to strike the Union forces if possible, but to also be prepared to fall back on Richmond. All these reinforcements would swell Jackson's army to 18,000 men. By the next day, Fremont was at Mount Jackson. Jackson re-entered the valley but did not attack. Rather, he encamped his men at Weir's Cave and rested them while planning an audacious offensive. Writing Congressman Boteler, he urged him to convince Richmond to reinforce him to 40,000 troops. With that number, he would cross the Blue Ridge Mountains, march north, then re-enter the valley, get behind Banks at Winchester, destroy him, cross the Potomac at Williamsport, and begin his invasion of the North. By the 14th, Fremont had fallen all the way back to Middletown, where he joined with the forces of Banks and Major General Francis Sigel, who had replaced Saxton. In spite of these reinforcements, there was no plan to resume an offensive up the valley again. On June 16th, Lee politely ordered Jackson to come to Richmond. The next day, Jackson ordered Whiting's 2 brigades to leave Stanton and move to Gordonsville. As was the case with major movements prior, Jackson told his subordinate commanders very little of his plans. This irritated Whiting greatly, having just arrived in the valley only to prepare to leave it again. He scoffed that Jackson, quote, hasn't more sense than my horse, and that this back and forth proved that the man was a fool. Very early in the morning on the 18th, Jackson's army began marching to Waynesboro to leave the valley through the Rockfish Gap. With that, the Valley Campaign of 1862 was over. The last 2 victories, Cross Keys and Port Republic, catapulted Jackson to national fame. The Confederacy, which looked to be in an extremely dire condition at the time, having lost a major battle at Shiloh just a few months prior, and with McClellan's enormous army within sight of the capital, reveled in this source of good news. Newspapers that had mocked and scoffed at Jackson earlier in the year now proclaimed him the Gamecock of the Valley. In months of campaigning, Jackson had inflicted about 4,000 Union casualties at the cost of 2,750 of his own. He had diverted tens of thousands of Federals bound for Richmond just when McClellan could have used them most. He also exposed the severe inadequacies in Union leadership and logistics. At the same time, Jackson ran his men ragged, losing thousands to straggling on his arduous marches. He often threw regiments into battle piecemeal, and without brigade commanders knowing the overall strategy. 4,000 of his men fell out of the ranks in his campaigning, some to desert, but others simply withering from exhaustion. A letter by Colonel Fulkerson is especially illuminating of the feelings of the men and officers under Jackson. Our general will certainly not give us much time while there is an enemy to meet. He is a singular man and has some most striking military traits of character, and some that are not so good. A more fearless man never lived, and he is remarkable for his industry and energy. He is strictly temperate in his habits and sleeps very little. Often, while near the enemy, and while everybody except the guards are asleep, he is on his horse and gone, nobody knows where. I often fear that he will be killed or taken. Our men curse him for the hard marching he makes them do. but still the privates of the whole army have the most unbounded confidence in him. They say he can take them into harder places and get them out better than any other living man, and that he cannot be caught asleep or taken when awake. I just want to thank everyone for sticking with this long process. I know it's years late, but it's finally finished. I hope to continue doing this, and I also want to plug Peter Cozen's book, Shenandoah 1862, Stonewall Jackson's Valley Campaign, from the University of North Carolina Press. It's an excellent book. It's a pretty easy read. It's very detailed, and I encourage you to buy it if you want to learn more about the Valley Campaign. This animation project only touched on the most basic details in the book, and there's a lot more in the text to discover. Thanks again.